Chris Evans lay sprawled on his worn-out couch, lazily scrolling through the dating app on his phone. His thumb swiped right, then left, the profiles blending together in a monotonous blur. Each face seemed identical, every bio filled with meaningless buzzwords that failed to spark any real interest. It was exhausting, and Chris was on the verge of giving up on the whole online dating experiment. His apartment was as minimal as his social life: bare walls, a TV flickering in the corner, and the ever-present hum of loneliness that seemed to settle around him like a heavy fog. He was tired of the mindless small talk at bars and the shallow connections that fizzled out before they even began. Something needed to change. Just as his finger hovered over the screen, ready to close the app for good, a profile caught his eye. Scarlet. The name alone felt like a breath of fresh air, pulling him in before he even saw the picture. And when the image loaded, Chris felt his breath hitch. She was beautiful, red hair cascading in loose waves, green eyes sharp and alluring, her expression one of subtle amusement, as if she knew something he didn't. But it wasn't just her looks that captivated him, it was the mystery. Her profile was sparse, just a few words: adventurer, seeker of the unusual. Let's make memories where no one else dares to go. Chris hesitated. She seemed too perfect, almost unreal. Could someone like her really exist, or was this just another elaborate fantasy crafted by the digital world? His thumb wavered. He was tired of disappointment, but loneliness had a way of making decisions for you. Before he could think twice, he swiped right. The screen flashed. It's a match. His heart raced. He immediately tapped out a message, something simple, trying to sound casual. Hey, nice to meet you. Love your adventurous vibe. He put the phone down, feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety. It buzzed almost instantly, and when he saw her name pop up in his notifications, a jolt of adrenaline shot through him. Nice to meet you too, Chris. Ever been to Cedar Ridge Forest? Chris gripped the steering wheel tighter as he drove down the winding road toward Cedar Ridge Forest. The dense trees loomed ahead, their shadows stretching across the highway like long, skeletal fingers. His stomach was a knot of nervous energy. He'd never agreed to something so impulsive, especially not for a first date. But Scarlet had a way of making everything sound like an adventure, like there was nothing to fear in taking risks. His phone sat on the passenger seat, Scarlet's last message still open: let's meet at the trailhead. It's beautiful this time of year, and we'll have the place to ourselves. That part stuck with him, the place to ourselves. He hadn't been to Cedar Ridge in years, but he remembered it as a vast, sprawling forest with miles of trails and very few visitors. Now, as he turned into the almost deserted parking lot, that emptiness felt more unsettling than peaceful. Only one other car sat in the lot, its windows fogged from the morning chill. He parked beside it and sat for a moment, the engine's hum filling the silence. Chris stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. The air was crisp, the scent of pine heavy around him. But something about the stillness made the back of his neck prickle. He checked his phone, nothing from Scarlet yet. A creeping unease settled in his gut, but before he could let it take root, he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. Chris. He turned, and there she was. Scarlet stood by her car, her red hair glowing in the sunlight, a small smile playing on her lips. The unease melted away, replaced by a flood of relief. Her beauty in person was even more striking, and her presence seemed to light up the entire forest. Hey, Chris said, trying to keep his voice steady. This place is really something. Scarlet's smile widened. It is. And I know just the spot. Come on. She reached for his hand, and before Chris could process it, he was following her deeper into the forest. Her grip was firm, her pace confident, like she knew exactly where she was going. The trees closed in around them, their towering forms casting long shadows that swallowed the trail. Chris tried to shake off the gnawing feeling that they were going somewhere they weren't supposed to. The clearing was beautiful, just as Scarlet had promised. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled light across the ground. In the distance, a scenic overlook offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. A soft breeze stirred the leaves, the only sound in an otherwise silent forest. Scarlet spread out a blanket, pulling a simple picnic from her bag. Sandwiches, fruit, a bottle of wine. It felt almost too perfect, like something out of a magazine. They sat together, the awkwardness of first-date small talk fading as they ate. Chris found himself opening up more than he usually would. Scarlet had a way of making him feel seen, understood. She laughed at his jokes, asked about his life, but never gave much away about her own. "So, what about you?" Chris asked, leaning back on his hands. "What do you do for work?" Scarlet smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I do a little of everything. I like to keep things interesting." Chris chuckled. "Mysterious. I like that." They lapsed into silence for a moment, the wind ruffling Scarlet's hair. The forest seemed unnaturally still, as if the world around them had paused. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Chris shifted, suddenly feeling like they were being watched. He glanced around, but saw nothing. "Do many people hike around here?" he asked. Scarlet shook her head. "Not really. It's why I love it, no distractions." Chris tried to push down the rising unease, but it clung to him like a shadow. He told himself he was overthinking it, that this was just a normal date. But something about the stillness of the forest, the way Scarlet seemed to dodge his questions, made his heart beat a little faster. "So," Scarlet said, breaking the silence, "how about a game?" Chris raised an eyebrow. "A game? Hide and seek?" She grinned, a playful glint in her eyes. "Come on, it'll be fun." "Just you and me." Chris laughed. "Hide and seek? Isn't that a bit childish?" Scarlet's smile didn't waver. "Maybe. But it's more fun than you'd think." He wanted to say no, wanted to tell her it was ridiculous, but something in her gaze pulled him in. He shrugged, smiling back. "All right, fine. But if I find you too quickly, I expect a rematch." Scarlet winked. "Deal." Scarlet led Chris back to the trailhead, her excitement infectious. "You hide first," she said, closing her eyes and starting to count. 1, 2, 3. Chris jogged off, glancing over his shoulder to make sure she wasn't peeking. He didn't want to go too far into the woods, not with that unsettling feeling still nagging at him. He found a large tree not far from the path and ducked behind it, pressing his back against the rough bark. The silence was immediate. He could hear his own breathing, the rapid thump of his heartbeat in his chest. He waited, expecting to hear Scarlet's footsteps any second. But as the moments ticked by, the forest remained unnervingly quiet. Then, a sound, footsteps. But they weren't light and playful like Scarlet's had been. These were heavier, faster, like someone was running toward him. Chris's stomach tightened. Maybe she was trying to trick him, trying to spook him as part of the game. He peeked around the tree. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a mask, was approaching fast. Chris's blood turned to ice. This wasn't Scarlet. Before he could react, the man grabbed him, shoving him against the tree. A knife pressed against his throat. "Your phone. Wallet. Now." Chris's hands shook as he handed over his phone and wallet, his mind racing. The masked man snatched them, stepping back into the shadows of the forest before disappearing altogether. Chris stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. Where was Scarlet? He staggered back toward the clearing, the oppressive silence of the forest now deafening. His eyes scanned the area where they'd had their picnic, but everything was gone, no blanket, no food, no Scarlet. It was as if none of it had ever existed. "Scarlet," he called, his voice cracking with panic. Only the rustling of leaves answered him. Fear clawed at his chest. Something was terribly wrong. He was alone, deep in the forest, without a phone, without a clue of how to get out. The world around him had shifted, the once peaceful woods now feeling like a trap. Chris took a deep breath, his mind spiraling. Had she set him up? Was she part of this? A twig snapped in the distance, and Chris's heart stopped. He wasn't alone. He turned slowly, his pulse quickening. The sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. And then, silence. Chris stumbled through the dense undergrowth, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His legs ached, and his feet crunched loudly on the dry leaves beneath him. Every path, every tree, looked the same, and no matter which way he turned, it felt like he was just spiraling deeper into the heart of the forest. The towering trees, once awe-inspiring, now felt like they were closing in on him, twisting and knotting together to trap him in an endless maze. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows that stretched ominously across the ground. With each passing moment, the once beautiful landscape seemed to grow darker, more menacing. His nerves frayed as the daylight slipped away, leaving him with nothing but the eerie stillness of Cedar Ridge Forest. Chris tried to retrace his steps, thinking if he could just get back to the trailhead, he could find his car and escape. But the more he moved, the further he seemed to drift from any recognizable landmarks. He glanced up at the trees, and that's when he saw it, carvings etched into the bark, fresh and raw, twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. They hadn't been there before. Were these some kind of markers? His heart skipped a beat. Were they meant to guide him? Or worse, were they guiding someone else toward him? Chris's breath hitched as a rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. His pulse quickened, and he turned, half expecting to see Scarlet. But there was no one. The silence pressed in on him, making the air feel thick and suffocating. "Scarlet," he whispered, the sound of his own voice unnerving in the stillness. The name barely left his lips before it died in the heavy, oppressive air. Just as he was about to turn and run, a flash of red caught his eye. Hanging from a low-hanging branch, like a forgotten flag, was Scarlet's scarf. His chest tightened. It was a breadcrumb, but was it meant to lead him to safety or deeper into the danger? Chris reached for the scarf, his fingers brushing against the soft fabric. It felt wrong in his hands, something once so simple now seemed tainted, like a relic from another world. He stuffed it into his pocket and quickened his pace, hoping against hope that following the path ahead would lead him back to some kind of civilization. But the trees pressed in tighter, the forest narrowing as if it were actively trying to close him in. His eyes scanned the ground as he walked, and soon enough, more unsettling details began to surface. A footprint in the dirt, larger than his own, leading off the trail. A flower, crushed underfoot, still fresh. And then, something metallic glinting just beneath a pile of leaves. He knelt, his hands trembling as he brushed away the debris. Beneath it was a small, rusted locket, the chain broken. He pried it open, revealing a faded photograph inside. It was a woman, someone he didn't recognize. The locket looked old, worn by time and neglect, but its placement here felt deliberate, like someone had left it for him to find. Chris felt a chill crawl down his spine. These weren't random objects. They were clues, breadcrumbs leading him further into the trap. His pulse quickened, every step now feeling more like a misstep. Was Scarlet leaving these things behind? Or was it someone else? Before he could fully process the thought, a twig snapped behind him, louder this time, unmistakable. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. There was nothing but shadows, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating, thick in the air like a fog. His instincts screamed at him to run. And without another thought, Chris took off, his feet pounding against the forest floor. Chris's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the forest. The footsteps behind him were unmistakable now, deliberate and steady, never hurried, but relentless. Someone was following him. No, not just following. Stalking. His legs burned, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him, every turn leading him deeper into the trees. He couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where he went, the forest would twist and reshape itself to trap him. The rhythmic crunch of boots on dry leaves echoed behind him, drawing closer with each turn. Chris veered off the main path, plunging into the thick underbrush. Branches scratched at his skin, and thorns caught at his clothes, but he pushed forward, desperate to lose his pursuer. But no matter how hard he ran, the footsteps behind him never faltered, never grew distant. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the day, every interaction with Scarlet. Could she have set him up? Was she involved in this nightmare? The thought gnawed at him, but there was no time to dwell on it. He had to survive. Chris ducked behind a thick oak tree, gasping for breath, his chest heaving. He pressed his back against the rough bark, trying to calm the pounding in his ears. His body trembled, not just from exertion, but from fear. He dared to peek around the trunk. In the distance, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a deliberate slowness that only heightened the terror. The man stopped, tilting his head as if listening, and then began moving again, faster this time. Chris's stomach dropped. He couldn't outrun him forever. He needed to hide. His eyes darted around the darkening forest, and he spotted a narrow hollow at the base of a large oak tree. It was just big enough for him to squeeze inside. Without hesitating, Chris dove into the hollow, curling himself into a tight ball, trying to quiet his breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, they stopped, just outside his hiding spot. The forest fell deathly silent. Chris held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest that he feared it would give him away. He could hear the figure outside, heavy breathing, the crunch of leaves underfoot. The man was close. Too close. Chris gripped Scarlet's scarf in his hands, his knuckles white as he fought back the overwhelming urge to flee. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but he knew that any movement now would mean the end. Suddenly, the figure bent down. Chris could see the man's shadow stretching across the ground, long and dark in the fading light. The man was searching, his boots crunching louder as he shuffled through the leaves. Chris's body tensed. The man's face, still hidden behind the mask, came into view just inches from the hollow. The glint of a knife shone in the dim light, its sharp edge catching the last sliver of the sun. Chris bit his lip, hard enough to draw blood, anything to stop himself from making a sound. The figure paused, crouched down, as if sensing something was there. Chris's lungs burned from holding his breath, every second stretching into an eternity. He could feel the man's gaze, even through the mask, as though he was deciding whether to strike. But after what felt like a lifetime, the figure stood, sheathing the knife. Chris remained frozen as he heard the footsteps retreat into the woods. The danger wasn't over, but for the moment, he had evaded it. Chris waited until the sound of footsteps had completely faded before he dared to move. His body ached, his muscles stiff from staying still for so long. Slowly, he crawled out of the hollow, wincing at the pain in his limbs. His breath came in ragged gasps, but at least he was alive, for now. But he knew this wasn't over. He had to find a way out of the forest before the darkness consumed everything. The temperature was dropping fast, and Chris's body shivered with cold and exhaustion. He pushed himself to his feet, stumbling forward through the thickening shadows. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. A cabin. Chris's heart leaped with hope. Maybe someone was inside. Maybe there was help. He quickened his pace, his footsteps now dragging as fatigue set in. As he approached the cabin, its outline became clearer, dilapidated, half hidden by overgrown vines and brush. The wooden structure sagged with age, but the faint glow from the window beckoned him forward. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped onto it, the sound echoing in the quiet night. He hesitated at the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. Slowly, he pushed it open, and the door swung inward with a long, drawn-out creak. The interior was worse than he had imagined. The furniture was broken, the floorboards cracked, and the walls were stained with something dark, something that smelled of rot. The air inside was heavy, thick with decay. But what made Chris's blood run cold was the wall. Pinned haphazardly to the peeling wallpaper were dozens of photographs. Faces, men, stared back at him, their expressions frozen in terror. And in the corner of each photo, standing in the background with that same enigmatic smile, was Scarlet. Chris stumbled back, the full weight of the horror crashing down on him. This wasn't just a robbery. This was a game, a twisted, sadistic game, and he was the next victim. As he stared at the photos, a horrifying realization struck him. He wasn't the only one being hunted. There were more out there, just like him. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the cabin, slow and deliberate. Chris turned toward the door, his heart pounding in his ears. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet. Chris's hands shook as he peeled the photographs off the wall of the decrepit cabin. The dim light from the flickering lantern cast eerie shadows across the rotting wooden floor. His breath came in sharp gasps, his mind racing as he scanned each image. Every man in the photos looked terrified, their eyes wide with panic, their bodies frozen in poses of desperation. And there, in the background of every photo, stood Scarlet. She looked younger in some of the pictures, older in others, But her expression was always the same, an unsettling, calm smile. Different outfits, different settings, but always the same smile. It sent a chill down Chris's spine. His hands trembled as he pulled another photograph off the wall. This one hit him harder than the rest. It was of a man sitting at a familiar picnic spot, the very same spot where he and Scarlet had eaten just hours earlier. A sense of dread washed over him, threatening to crush him under its weight. This wasn't just a chance encounter with a stranger. This was planned. Scarlet wasn't just a participant, she was the orchestrator. Chris's thoughts spiraled, each revelation more horrifying than the last. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave, but his body felt rooted in place. A sudden creak echoed from outside the cabin, breaking the silence. Chris froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The hunters. They were close. His instincts screamed at him to run, but where could he go? Staying in the cabin was a death sentence, but outside lurked the predators. Desperation surged through him. He had to move, had to find something, anything, that could help him survive. His hands frantically searched through the drawers of a nearby desk, his fingers scraping against rough wood and dust. That's when he found it, a faded map of the forest. Several spots were marked with ominous XS, and the cabin was one of them. It wasn't just a random hiding place. It was part of a deadly trail. A trail of death. He stuffed the map into his pocket, knowing it might be his only chance. Then, with one last glance at the photographs, he slipped out the back door, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The forest was even darker now, the thick canopy of trees blocking out most of the moonlight. Chris moved quietly, crouching low as he navigated through the underbrush. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid. The sounds of the hunter's boots crunching on leaves echoed behind him, too close for comfort. He hugged the side of the cabin, inching along the rough wooden walls until he reached the safety of the trees. He needed to stay silent. One wrong move, one loud crack of a twig, and they'd know where he was. Just as he began to feel a sliver of hope that he might evade them, he heard voices. Rough, low, and far too close. Chris dropped to the ground, pressing himself into the dirt behind a fallen log. He peered through the leaves, his breath catching in his throat as two men emerged from the shadows, rifles slung over their shoulders. They were walking toward the cabin, scanning the forest with keen eyes. Chris's heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he was sure they would hear it. He held his breath as they stopped, their voices clearer now. "He can't have gone far," one of them muttered. "Scarlet's still out there too. Keep your eyes peeled." The mention of Scarlet sent another wave of terror through Chris. It was clear now, this wasn't a random robbery or some isolated incident. These hunters were organized, seasoned, and they thrived on this twisted game. "Let's move to the next phase," the second man said, his voice dripping with malice. "We don't want him getting too far." Chris's blood ran cold. The next phase. What did that mean? He waited, trembling, as the hunters passed by his hiding spot, their heavy boots thudding against the ground. He stayed frozen until their voices faded into the distance. Then, slowly, carefully, he crawled out from behind the log. His muscles were stiff, his body shaking with adrenaline. He couldn't stay here. He had to move, had to escape. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the map, his eyes scanning the markings. There were other spots marked further into the forest. Maybe, just maybe, they could lead him out of this nightmare. The deeper Chris ventured into the forest, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to press in from all sides, their twisted branches forming an impenetrable wall. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig sent his heart racing. He kept one hand on the map, the other ready to push through the thick underbrush. His body ached from exhaustion, his mind racing with panic. He couldn't keep this up much longer. Just when he thought he couldn't go any further, he spotted movement up ahead. His breath caught in his throat. Was it one of the hunters? He ducked behind a tree, peering through the darkness. A figure was limping toward him, and as it got closer, Chris could make out the shape of a woman. She looked pale, terrified, and her clothes were torn. Chris hesitated, his heart pounding. Could she be another victim like him? Or was this a trap? The woman spotted him, her eyes widening in desperation. "Please, help me," she cried, stumbling forward. Chris tensed, unsure whether to step out or stay hidden. After everything that had happened, he couldn't afford to trust anyone easily. But she looked genuinely terrified. Could he really leave her to fend for herself? He stepped out from behind the tree, but kept his distance. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low, wary. The woman paused, catching her breath. "Lily," she said, her voice shaky. "I've been stuck here for weeks. Scarlet lured me in, just like she did you. I've been hiding, trying to survive." Chris felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief that he wasn't alone, mixed with suspicion. After all, he had trusted Scarlet once, and look where that had led him. "Why should I trust you?" he demanded, his grip tightening on the map in his pocket. Lily looked at him with wide, pleading eyes. "I don't have anyone else. If we don't stick together, we're both going to die out here." Chris hesitated. He couldn't afford to be reckless, but he also couldn't risk being completely alone in this nightmare. He nodded, slowly, keeping his guard up as they continued deeper into the forest. The night was growing colder, the forest bathed in faint moonlight. Chris and Lily moved cautiously through the trees, their footsteps quiet, careful. Chris kept glancing at the map, leading them toward one of the marked clearings. As they walked, Lily spoke in hushed tones, explaining more about the hunters. "They're part of a group," she said, her voice trembling. "Wealthy people who pay to watch others get hunted. It's like some twisted sport. Scarlet, she's just one of many women they use to lure victims." Chris listened carefully, his mind whirling with the new information. But something about Lily's story didn't sit right with him. She said she'd been running for weeks, yet her clothes didn't look that worn. And she had a knife that seemed far too clean for someone who had been scavenging for survival. Was she telling the truth? Or was she leading him into another trap? His paranoia grew with every step, but he couldn't afford to push her away just yet. He needed an ally, even if he wasn't sure he could trust her. The deeper they went into the forest, the more he started to question everything she said. They reached a clearing, one of the spots marked on the map, but Chris immediately felt a sense of dread. The air was too still, the trees too quiet. Something was wrong. "We shouldn't stay here," Chris whispered, pulling Lily aside. She looked confused, but before she could respond, the bushes nearby rustled. Chris's body tensed. Someone, or something, was coming. Chris and Lily froze as a figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees. A man, tall and menacing, carrying a rifle with a cruel smile on his face. His eyes locked onto Chris with a predatory gleam. "Thought you'd make it a little further than this," the hunter said, his voice dripping with mockery. Chris's heart pounded in his chest, his body coiled with tension. He took a step back, but something in the pit of his stomach turned icy cold. Lily wasn't moving. In fact, she wasn't even scared. Chris glanced at her, and the realization hit him like a punch. Lily was part of this. "You almost had me believing you," she said, her voice losing its previous shakiness, replaced by a smooth, confident tone. "But this is the end of the line." Chris's mind reeled. He had been played again. Trapped. More hunters emerged from the woods, their faces hidden by masks, their weapons pointed directly at him. Chris's pulse raced as he scanned the clearing for any possible escape. His survival instinct kicked in. He might be trapped, but he wasn't ready to give up. The hunters closed in, and Chris made a split-second decision. His muscles tensed, preparing for a desperate fight. The game wasn't over yet. The clearing in the dark forest seemed to close in on Chris as the hunters circled. Cold moonlight bathed the area, casting sharp, eerie shadows on the ground. The metallic taste of fear sat heavy on Chris's tongue, and his heart pounded as the adrenaline surged through his veins. He had no time to think, only time to act. With a swift motion, Chris kicked a spray of dirt into the closest hunter's eyes. The man stumbled, cursing, while Chris grabbed a nearby rock and swung it at Lily. She staggered, surprise flashing across her face as she fell to the ground. It gave him just enough time. Chris bolted into the thick woods, weaving through the trees as bullets whizzed past him, tearing into bark and dirt. One grazed his arm, a sharp, searing pain that nearly dropped him, but he couldn't stop now. Every step felt like a last-ditch attempt at life. Branches scratched his face and arms as he sprinted through the undergrowth. He heard the hunters shouting, their voices closer than he wanted to admit. His vision blurred, his breath ragged, and the forest became a blur of shadows and sounds. He could feel the blood from the wound on his arm soaking his shirt, the pain pulsing with every heartbeat. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him. Chris tumbled down a steep ravine, his body hitting rocks and roots as he fell. The world spun, and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the dark sky above. When Chris awoke, the cold ground beneath him sent chills through his aching body. He groaned, his head throbbing and the taste of blood lingering in his mouth. The dim light in the room around him was suffocatingly dark, the air damp with mildew. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious, but his body felt like it had been through a war. Slowly, Chris pushed himself up, wincing as he looked around. He was inside a bunker, a small, decaying underground hideout barely noticeable from the surface. The air smelled of rot, and the walls were streaked with grime and moisture. His arm throbbed, the blood from the bullet graze already soaking through the makeshift bandage he'd made with his torn shirt. He limped through the bunker's narrow corridors, scanning his surroundings. Old papers littered the floor, crumpled and yellowed with age. Chris picked one up and saw a map of Cedar Ridge Forest, with red XS marking locations just like the cabin. More papers were scattered, notes, photographs, and plans. His eyes landed on a ledger. Flipping it open, he saw dozens of names, most of them crossed off with red ink. Each name had a date next to it. His heart sank when he found his own name marked with today's date. His blood ran cold. This was no isolated incident. This was an ongoing operation, a deadly sport for the rich, who paid to hunt human beings for their sick pleasure. And Scarlet? She wasn't just some pawn. She was part of the machinery that made it all happen. Chris clenched his fists, the horror of it all fueling his desperation. He couldn't escape them forever, not like this. But if he could get to their base camp, maybe he could find a way to stop this twisted game from continuing. He ransacked the bunker, gathering what little he could: an old hunting knife, a flashlight, and a map of the hunter's base camp. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Determined, Chris limped out of the bunker and into the forest once more. The moonlight filtered weakly through the trees as Chris made his way toward the hunter's base camp. His vision blurred with exhaustion, and every step sent a wave of pain through his body, but he forced himself forward. He followed the map, his fingers trembling as he clutched it like a lifeline. Eventually, he reached the outskirts of the camp. From behind a large rock, Chris peered through the branches, taking in the scene below. Tents were scattered across the clearing, lanterns illuminating the area in a sickly yellow glow. He could see armed hunters patrolling the perimeter, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Vehicles were parked nearby, their engines idling quietly, ready for a quick getaway if needed. But what made Chris's stomach turn was the group of wealthy patrons gathered around several large monitors. They were laughing, drinking, and placing bets on the remaining victims in the forest. Some monitors showed live feeds of the woods, tracking people just like him as they desperately tried to escape. And there, sitting in the center of it all, was Scarlet. She was smiling, leaning toward a man in a tailored suit, as they spoke in low voices. The sight of her sent a surge of anger through Chris's veins. He couldn't take them head-on, not like this. But if he could disable the generator, maybe he could plunge the camp into chaos long enough to make his move. He spotted the generator near the edge of the camp and made his way toward it, each step growing heavier as he lost more blood. When he reached the generator, he knelt down and began cutting the wires with the hunting knife, his hands slick with sweat. The pain in his arm was unbearable, but he gritted his teeth and kept working. Finally, the wires sparked, and the generator went silent. The camp plunged into partial darkness as the surveillance towers went down. But Chris had no time to relish his small victory. A shout rang out behind him. One of the hunters had spotted him. Gunfire erupted as Chris sprinted toward the main tent, weaving through the chaos. His body screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. Chris burst into the main tent, gasping for breath, his legs barely able to carry him. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The wealthy patrons stood frozen, their drinks spilling as they watched the bloodied man standing in the doorway. Scarlet's smile faltered, her expression shifting from mild amusement to curiosity. She stood up slowly, her eyes scanning Chris as if he were a curiosity, a broken toy that had lasted longer than expected. Chris stumbled toward her, clutching the knife in his trembling hand. His vision blurred with exhaustion and rage. "Why?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this?" Scarlet tilted her head, her lips curling into a smirk. "Because it's fun," she said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. She took a few steps closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You're so predictable, Chris. People like you, lonely, desperate, you're easy to manipulate. It's nothing personal. It's just business." Chris's vision swam as he lunged at her, but his body gave out. He crumpled to the ground, the knife slipping from his grip. Scarlet stood over him, looking down with a mix of pity and amusement. "You never had a chance," she whispered. The hunters moved toward him, but Chris wasn't done yet. With trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the map he'd taken from the bunker. He threw it onto the table. "I know where all your camps are," he wheezed. "If I don't make it, someone else will." The room went silent. The patrons exchanged nervous glances, their confidence faltering for the first time. For a brief moment, confusion rippled through the camp. The patrons murmured among themselves, doubt creeping into their smug expressions. Scarlet's gaze flickered with the slightest hint of uncertainty. But then, something shifted. A gunshot rang out from behind her, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Chris watched in disbelief as Scarlet's eyes widened in shock, her body jerking forward as the bullet tore through her back. She collapsed to the ground, her smirk frozen on her lips. Chris looked up to see one of the patrons, a man in a sleek black suit, lowering his gun. He stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips. "It was always about the highest bidder," he said, his voice smooth and casual. "Your time is up, Scarlet." Horror washed over Chris as he realized the game wasn't about to end, it was evolving. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a blood-soaked power struggle, a contest of control among the wealthy monsters who thrived on chaos and betrayal. The man in the suit turned his gun on Chris. "Don't worry," he said with a smile. "You're next." But before he could fire, chaos erupted outside. The camp was in full disarray, the generator failure and Chris's sabotage had thrown everything into darkness. Hunters scrambled to regain control as confusion spread. Chris used the moment of distraction to crawl toward the tent's exit. His vision was dimming, his body shutting down, but he had one last chance to escape. He had to keep moving. He had to survive. The forest called to him, and with the last of his strength, Chris staggered into the night, knowing his fight wasn't over yet. Chris stumbled through the dense, suffocating forest, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. Each step felt like a monumental effort as the cold night air gnawed at his open wounds. His legs were barely carrying him now, his mind clouded with exhaustion and desperation. The forest that had once felt alive with the sound of wildlife now seemed to conspire against him, its twisting paths leading him nowhere. Behind him, gunfire cracked through the silence, the hunters closing in. Every time Chris thought he'd gained some ground, the relentless pursuit picked up again, forcing him deeper into the dark labyrinth of trees. His body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. If he did, it was over. He tripped over a root, crashing hard to the ground, dirt filling his mouth. For a moment, he lay there, his cheek pressed against the cold earth. Giving up seemed easy, the idea of letting the forest swallow him almost a relief. But then the image of Scarlet's smug, mocking smile burned in his mind, and rage fueled a final burst of adrenaline. Pushing himself to his feet, Chris forced his legs to move. He spotted the faint outline of the road just beyond the last line of trees. The distant lights were a beacon, pulling him forward. Salvation. But the hunters were close, too close. He heard footsteps, the snap of branches underfoot, their voices barking commands. Chris stumbled forward, the forest spinning around him, the road so close yet so far. Just as he broke through the tree line, a bullet whizzed past his ear, forcing him to dive to the ground. His body hit the earth hard, but he managed to roll behind a thick tree trunk for cover. Panting heavily, he glanced up. The road was only a few 100 feet away. Hope flickered. But the hunters were faster than him. He wouldn't make it unless something changed. Chris crawled toward the road, his vision blurring with each movement. The rough ground tore at his hands and knees, but he barely felt the pain now. He was running on pure survival instinct. Blood from the bullet graze on his arm soaked his shirt, but he pushed forward, the thought of freedom driving him. When he finally reached the edge of the road, he collapsed, his body spent. The cold asphalt beneath him felt like victory. He had made it. Just a few more feet, and he'd be free. He raised his head weakly, the outline of headlights in the distance growing closer. The car slowed as it neared him, its headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. Chris tried to lift his hand, but his strength was gone. He could barely move, barely think. The car came to a stop just a few feet away from him, the engine idling softly in the quiet night. The car door opened, and a figure stepped out. Tall, slender, and familiar. Scarlet. Her silhouette was framed by the headlights, her expression calm and composed. She walked toward him, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, a small smile playing on her lips. "You didn't really think it would be that easy, did you?" she asked, her voice dripping with amusement. Chris's mind reeled. He could barely process what was happening. His body was too weak, his thoughts too clouded with pain and exhaustion. Scarlet crouched beside him, her fingers gently brushing across his blood-streaked cheek. The touch was cold, calculated. "You were fun," she said, her voice soft but devoid of warmth. "You fought harder than most. But the game has to end sometime." Her eyes glittered in the dim light, cold and unfeeling. Chris tried to speak, to ask why she had done this, but his mouth refused to form the words. He was trapped in his own body, helpless as she stood up and stepped back toward the car. The trunk opened with a heavy click, and Chris's heart sank as another figure stepped into view. The masked man who had attacked him in the forest. His expression was hidden behind the smooth white mask, but Chris knew what was coming. The man grabbed Chris by the collar, lifting him off the ground with ease. Chris's body felt weightless, limp, as he was thrown into the trunk. The world tilted, and the hard, cold metal pressed against his battered body. Scarlet's voice echoed through the trunk as it began to close, muffled but clear. "We'll be seeing you again, Chris. The game never truly ends." The lid slammed shut, plunging Chris into darkness. Inside the cramped, suffocating trunk, Chris lay still, his breathing shallow and ragged. The car sped down the road, each bump sending waves of agony through his broken body. He could feel his consciousness slipping, but he fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep meant surrender. As the car rumbled through the night, Chris's mind drifted. He realized now that this was never just about him. He had been foolish to think otherwise. The photos in the cabin, the names in the ledger, it had all been part of something much bigger. Something crueler. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a piece in their game, just one of many before him, and there would be many more after him. Scarlet and her patrons thrived on this, on manipulating the lonely, the desperate, and turning them into prey for their sick sport. The weight of the realization crushed him. There was no escape. The moment he swiped right on Scarlet's profile, his fate had been sealed. His body was shutting down now, the darkness closing in. His mind replayed the brief moments of hope he'd clung to, each one now a hollow mockery of the truth. No one escaped Cedar Ridge Forest. No one ever had. The game was rigged from the start. As his eyelids fluttered shut, Chris heard the distant sound of Scarlet's laughter, cold and echoing in his ears, a final reminder of the game he could never win. Days later, in a sleek, upscale office high above the bustling city streets, Scarlet sat at her desk. Her polished demeanor and professional appearance were worlds away from the cold predator Chris had encountered in the forest. She scrolled through profiles on her phone, swiping left, then right, as she searched for the next player. Each face that flashed across the screen was just another potential victim, another pawn in the endless game. Her phone buzzed with a new message. One of the patrons from the previous hunt. "Congratulations on the success of the last game. We're eager for the next one. More money this time." Scarlet's smile widened as she typed a quick response. "Don't worry. The next player is already lined up. She glanced out the window, watching the city below, the world oblivious to the horrors she orchestrated. With a satisfied sigh, she swiped right on a new profile, another unsuspecting man who had no idea what was coming. The game was never ending. And there would always be someone new to play.